Kicking off this afternoon's guest speaker slate is our past Historian General, Dr. William Dudley.
Aloha, everyone. I beg your indulgence on two matters. First of all, I'm sitting. I didn't want to be up here like an ancient mariner with a peg leg and all of a sudden collapse on you. So I will sit for my presentation. Secondly, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, and I will be reading most of my remarks. This is a subject which is quite complex and out of the way in terms of the usual treatment of the Navy on the Barbary Coast. As I was asked to do this talk, it was stipulated that we should really approach this with more of a binational or bicultural perspective. In other words, don't just approach this from the U.S. Navy's point of view. Look at the subject from the Islamic point of view as much as you can. Well, I am not an Islamic scholar, but I have managed a perspective by means of diplomacy, that is, through the diplomatic record as well as the naval record. So that is how I'm going to approach this. First of all, it is a over 30-year period of time that we are looking at, and I'm starting at the beginning. So this is I will treat first of all the diplomatic aspects from the end of the Revolutionary War up until Jefferson's first administration. Then we'll move into the naval side, and then we'll do a balance both sides up until the period ending at 1816. This talk is a clash of maritime cultures, the U.S. Navy versus the Islamic Corsairs, 1783 to 1816. The purpose of this presentation is to discuss the origins of the Navy's Mediterranean Squadron and the part it played as the new instrument of American foreign policy. At the same time, it is important to examine the diplomatic relations between the Barbary Coast Islamic regencies and the United States, which were foreshadowing of future events. The twin poles of this narrative are the final act of the American Revolution, the Treaty of Paris of 1783, and our naval wars in the Mediterranean, 1801 to 1816. Between these dates, the United States grew from a republic that was barely capable of self-defense to an awkward young nation probing the limits of national self-determination through commerce and the use of naval and military power. In doing so, the United States found itself in conflict with the Barbary regencies, whose seafarers had deep roots in the Mediterranean past, originating in the 8th century AD, when Islamic seafarers emerged to challenge the fleets of Byzantium. This led to unexpected consequences and outcomes for both sides. The founders of the Republic, familiar with the writings of Hugo Grotius and Adam Smith, had acquired a deep belief in the freedom of the seas as the best possible environment for America's neutral merchantmen. But they found that the Mediterranean Sea was anything but free. These developments had their inception in the American Revolution. With the Treaty of Paris, the United States relinquished any claim she might have had to the protection of the British Navy. American merchantmen venturing into the Mediterranean were forced to defend themselves, if possible, when attacked by pirates or ships of an enemy state. It was not long before ships from Algiers on the Barbary Coast seized American merchant ships and their crews. The Algerians either converted these ships for their own use or sold them and held the crews hostage. This state of affairs festered during the years that the United States was forging its Constitution and essential institutions of national government, including naval and military forces. It was becoming all too clear that a maritime cultural crisis was in the making for the United States, particularly in the unaccustomed type of warfare in the Turkish Sultanate had frequently depended on ship captures rather than commerce as their principal means of income. The immediate gains of their seizures were plunder, captives, and ships. The captives were treated and used as slaves until ransom could be negotiated with the subjects' governments. In attempting to forestall future captures and hostage taking, European governments commonly agreed to pay tribute in the form of money, supplies, military, and naval stores. In addition, cash gifts were commonly accompanied with new envoys to pave the way for smooth diplomatic relationships. By their willingness to suffer, reward, and manipulate the rapacious behavior of the Barbary states, the European nations encouraged it. There were times, as in the mid to late 17th century, when Holland and England and France fought among themselves, and this provided opportunities for expansion of corsair activity. Algiers was then the strongest seafaring regency. But even so, Tripoli, viewed as having the least powerful fleet, sent out 15 to 20 corsairs per year, ranging in form and size from small galleys to a 46-gun warship. The commanders of these galleys were often Turks or renegade, often Greek Christians. Metropolitan cruising grounds were in the central Mediterranean near the coasts of Italy and Greece. From 1680 to 1699, as at the Battle of Lepanto a century earlier, warfare between Ottoman Turks and the Habsburg Empire was fought on sea as well as on land. At such times, the Ottoman Sultan called upon the regencies Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli to provide him with corsair warships for which he paid. They would serve without pay, but would keep any prizes and prisoners they captured. The predatory maritime practices of the Barbary regencies have traditionally been considered private piracy by American and other historians. Yet there is good reason to interpret their behavior as more akin to privateering, since they operated under the orders of the Islamic Regency chieftains in their warfaring practices. Their owners and ship captains were obliged to pay a portion of their plunder to their overlord and to hand over captured ship crews and passengers to his control as well. They thus operated within a legal framework, and even though many privately owned their ships, they had to receive permission to set out on their voyages. There was also another major difference. Ship captains were not usually restricted as to the ships they could capture, such as those of a particular nationality. Since Islamic warfare against Christians was deemed perpetual, they could attack whom they chose unless a truce had been declared or a treaty was in effect. The unfortunate captives of such operations were not considered prisoners of war. They were rather enslaved. Depending on their wealth, social rank, or political importance, some might be well treated, but would not be released until ransomed by the ship owners or the nation of which they were subjects or citizens. If the captured seafarers were ordinary sailors or passengers, they were subjected to hard labor, imprisonment, harassment, and abuse, especially if they were Christians. Usually the Islamic Corsairs cruised singly and did not join in alliances with other Regency Corsairs. As historian Lincoln Payne has stated, lack of coordination and shared purpose on the part of Muslim states underscores the fact that while it is customary to think in terms of a Mediterranean divided into Christian and Muslim spheres of influence, power among the liberal states split among innumerable secular and religious fault lines. Among the eyewitness accounts of Algerine seafarers, we have James Cathcart, who spent 11 years as a prisoner in Algiers. Cathcart had held a warrant as a midshipman on the Continental Frigate Confederacy during the American Revolution. In 1785, he was working a passage in the merchant ship Maria, heading from Boston to the Mediterranean, when his ship was stopped by an Algerian xebec as they were nearing the Strait of Gibraltar. He and all his shipmates were made slaves in order to join hundreds of others who were invariably Christians to do all the hard work, physical work required in the port. He was in a good position to see how slaves rigged, repaired, and made the Corsairs cruisers ready for sea. The captains and other vessels of these vessels were often Turks, Moors, or Mamelukes, or renegade Christian sea captains who had turned Turk. Aside from a few able Algerine seamen, the crew was made up of ordinary townsmen, quote, inferior Moors or country Arabs, unquote, who had other trades when not at sea. When cruisers were about to depart, these men were rounded up and forcibly driven to the waterfront with nothing but their clothes on their back. Although compromising an informal fighting force, in other words, Marines, of the cruisers, they were not at all familiar with working the great guns. However, armed with swords and other edged weapons, combined with the native hostility toward Christians, they were a formidable fighting force when boarding an enemy ship. As Cathcart himself put it, as an enemy, they ought not to be undervalued. In 1784, the Emperor of Morocco ordered the American ship Betsy to be detained and held hostage until the conclusion of a treaty of friendship and commerce. In May of that year, the United States established a commission to negotiate treaties of amity and commerce with Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. At that time, John Jay had become Secretary of State for Foreign Relations of the United States. John Adams had been appointed Minister to Great Britain, and Thomas Jefferson replaced Jay as Minister to France. With the invaluable assistance of diplomatic agent Thomas Barclay and Commissioners Adams and Jefferson, obtained a treaty in Morocco in 1787 in which the United States was not obliged to pay tribute. This was a unique accomplishment, and considering other nations still yielded to this practice, but treaties remained to be established with the other three regencies. The Emperor of Morocco's motive in agreeing to such an agreement can be ascribed to his dislike of the British and his admiration of the American Republic for successfully fighting the British. His attitude, however, was not shared by the other North African rulers. The difference in cultures accounts for many of the difficulties American diplomats confronted in creating agreements with the Barbary Coast regencies. The commissioners faced two difficult issues: the Islamic concept of jihad, a permanent holy war against the infidel, and the regencies claimed that the Mediterranean was their territorial sea and that they had a right to exert control over it. In both cases, maritime war seemed inevitable unless the United States could meet the Islamist terms of agreement. John Adams's negotiations with the Algerians led only to their unacceptable proposal that the United States pay 30,000 guineas for perpetual peace, or as historian James Field stated, term insurance at $12,500 per year. The American government, under the Articles of Confederation, was nearly bankrupt and could not afford to pay such tribute even if Congress had permitted it. The commissioners worked hard for little result and were of different minds as to how to remedy the situation. Adams, who had helped establish the Continental Navy, was disillusioned by the failure of his efforts and thought it unlikely that the United States would fight. He reluctantly came to the view that his government should pay tribute and get on with the trade. When Adams had an interview with Sidi Haji Abdul Rahman Ajah, the Tripolitan ambassador to Great Britain, in February 1786, he asked Ajah why, if there had been no hostility, injury, insults, or provocations between the United States and the Barbary states, why should it be considered a war? The ambassador answered that Turkey, Tunis, Tripoli, Algiers, and Morocco were sovereigns of the Mediterranean, and that no other nation could navigate that sea without having a treaty, otherwise a state of war existed. On a second occasion, Adams pointed out the United States was in financial difficulties, having recently completed a long and difficult war, and was in no condition to offer large payments for peace in the Mediterranean. The ambassador acknowledged that point, but in effect said the United States should at least make an offer which could be considered. Adams then told Jay the only possibility would be to obtain an additional loan from Holland. Interestingly, Jefferson was more stubborn and militant, advocating a more aggressive naval policy, though as president 15 years later, he gained a reputation as an anti-navalist. In 1784, he wrote James Monroe, "We ought to begin a naval power if we mean to carry on our own commerce. Can we begin it on a more honorable occasion or with a weaker foe? I am of the opinion that Commodore John Paul Jones, with half a dozen frigates, would totally destroy their commerce by constant cruising and cutting them to pieces by piecemeal," unquote. Ahead of his time as usual, Jefferson also believed that another possible solution would be the establishment of an international naval force that would keep piracy suppressed by continually cruising the Mediterranean. This visionary thought, however, would not come to fruition for over 200 years. John Jay advised that such a measure would be unwise and would subject the United States to embarrassment, since the government lacked the revenue acquired to pay America's share of an allied naval presence. In dealing with Tripoli and Algiers, the American representatives were unable to equal the tribute-free Moroccan treaty. The Neapolitan ambassador explained that his government's policy was founded, quote, on the laws of the prophet, that it was written in the Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority in the Mediterranean were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war on them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all who they could take as prisoners, and that every Mussulman who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. But it is interesting that the Neapolitans, while intent on fighting to protect their culture, were notably pragmatic in the application of warfare against infidels. An equitable treaty combined with the right price would end the fighting and the capturing of ships and crews, and would indeed could lead eventually to trade. Writing to Jefferson, Adams fulminated, quote, "The policy of Christendom has made cowards of all their sailors before the standard of Muhammad. It would be heroical and glorious in us to restore courage in ours." Unquote. Adams later despaired, saying that unless the United States could devise a better revenue system, your plan of fighting will be no more adopted than mine of negotiating. From 1786 to 1789, the United States was unsuccessful in negotiating solutions to the hostility of Algiers and Tripoli. As a result, the United States came to consider the establishment of a naval force as a necessary step in the protection of the commerce in the Mediterranean. With the inauguration of President George Washington and the commencement of the nation's new foreign affairs, the administration sought aid in far parts of Europe and in the hope of finding an ally whose diplomats and navy would protect American shipping in the Mediterranean. U.S. Minister Thomas Jefferson in France made vigorous protests and pleas, yet failed to enlist the needed support. Secretary of the Navy Henry Knox opened the controversial subject of constructing a navy to punish the Barbary states for interdicting American trade and enslaving a people who had just fought a war in order to be free. Congress's passage in March 1794 of an, quote, "an act to provide a naval armament called for the consideration of 6 frigates which would soon become the core of the reinvented United States Navy. It also required a halt of construction should a peace treaty with Algiers be approved. In the meantime, the first resort of the American government was to negotiate and offer ransom payments, an old world custom that was at first considered less expensive and less dangerous solution than creating and maintaining a fleet of warships. For a brief time, it was thought that a solution to the Algerine problem could still be found without resorting to force. Commodore John Paul Jones was residing in Paris and was well situated to represent American interests. But he was impoverished and in very poor health. Secretary of State Jefferson sent Jones a commission to act as an envoy to Algiers, but he died before receiving the commission, which was then passed to Thomas Barclay for implementation. Barclay also died soon thereafter, so the task to carry out the mission was given to David Humphreys, U.S. Minister to Portugal. As he was in the midst of doing so, it was learned in Portugal that there had been a Portuguese-Algerine truce. This meant that the Portuguese would no longer be able to suppress the Algerine raiders, who would now be able to sail out into the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic, and the American ships would be exposed to Barbary Corsairs on the high seas before entering the Mediterranean. The immediate result was a disaster for American shipping. Algerian Corsairs seized 11 vessels in October and November 1792, and U.S. maritime insurance rates of vessels sailing to the Mediterranean increased by 30%. The truce was an unpleasant surprise to the United States. During his tenure in London, Adams had assiduously cultivated the Portuguese ambassador in an effort to obtain recognition and a treaty of friendship and commerce. Adams had received assurances that Portugal would protect American merchantmen as well. As evidence of her goodwill and desire for friendship, Queen Maria II of Portugal sent a letter to Congress stating that as long as her warships cruised in the mouth of the Strait of Gibraltar, they would protect American vessels as they would her own. In 1791, Portugal became the first neutral country to recognize the independence of the United States. Yet 3 years later, with the Portuguese-Algerian truce, Portuguese warships could no longer provide the protection. And how this came about has been the subject of much inquiry and debate. At first, the Portuguese denied knowledge of the truce and claimed it was brought about by the unauthorized interference of a British consul in Algiers, one Charles Logie, who said he had negotiated the truce on behalf of the Portuguese government and at its request. Later, it became apparent that the decisions had been made in the highest echelons in the British government. Yet Foreign Secretary Lord Grenville claimed the request had first come from the Portuguese court, asking that Britain play an important intermediary negotiating role because Portugal had needs of its fleet to cooperate with Britain, then at war with France. He had requested the British ambassador, Robert Walpole, to arrange this through their consul in Algiers. Well, this is the way it worked out, but it is more likely that the original impetus came from the British, who had need of the Portuguese Navy's ships to augment its own efforts to contain the French Navy. Still, the Portuguese court was angry because they had no chance to review the terms of Logie's truce agreement, which had committed them to pay a large fee as a compensation, that is a fee to the Algerians, for the truce. So the Portuguese refused to pay and rejected the agreement, whereupon the Dey of Algiers wrote a steamy letter to protest to King George III, alleging the British had lured Algiers into the truce to take revenge on the Americans, and that this would be more for Britain's benefit than for Algiers. Nathaniel Cutting, secretary to David Humphrey, minister resident of Portugal, stated that Logie was hostile to Americans and had overstepped his limits by personally issuing certificates of clearance to Algerian corsairs to attack American shipping. In any event, Portugal's removal of its warships from the strait left the United States bereft of any means of protecting its merchantmen. This predicament led George Washington to authorize the building of the first frigates of the U.S. Navy. To renew negotiations with Hassan Pasha, Dey of Algiers, the United States sent its diplomatic agent, Joseph Donaldson, with instructions that he could offer as much as $800,000 for peace and ransom. Assisted by the Swedish consul and a member of the Bakri banking family, James Cathcart, they reached an agreement after months of haggling. This treaty, signed in 1795 and ratified in 1797, called for payment of some $585,500 and an annual gift of $21,600 or its equivalent in naval stores. However, a 2-year delay in payments upset the arrangement. To assuage the Dey's temper, in 1798, the United States agreed to give a completely outfitted 36-gun frigate named Crescent, plus a brig and 2 schooners, in exchange for the freedom of American seamen held in prison or bondage, and continued forbearance on the part of Algerian corsairs. The total cost of this treaty, including ransom, brokers' fees, gifts of ships, remittance fees, was estimated as high as $992,468, well beyond the originally claimed amount, so much so that the smaller European governments of Denmark and Sweden were alarmed that this would whet the appetites of Tunis and Tripoli. As an aside, I would say, it was an extraordinarily large amount of money that was spent. If you realize that the U.S. budget in that year was $8 million. 1/8 of the total budget, therefore, was to be spent in achieving a truce and a trade agreement with the government of Algiers. It shows you how much they wanted that trade, no matter what. The Tunis Regency was next on the American diplomats list. Discussions had been taking place since the middle 1790s, with the first result being a 6-month truce agreed to in June 1796. Conversations continued over the next 3 years, led by David Humphreys and Joel Barlow. Finally, a treaty of friendship and trade was concluded on March 26, 1799, at the expense of $179,044 to be paid by the United States, and the first U.S. consulate in Tunis opened its doors in January 1800. Tripoli remained an obstacle. In the 18th century, a Turkish janissary named Ahmed Karamanli overthrew the Turkish governor and persuaded the Ottomans to recognize him as governor. He established himself as Bashaw, made his post hereditary, and thereby created the Karamanli dynasty, which ruled Tripoli until the 1830s. Although he continued to pay nominal tribute to Ottoman Sultan Karamanli otherwise, acted as an independent ruler. He greatly expanded the Regency's economy, particularly through traditional employment of corsairs on crucial shipping routes. The region's delicate balance of power allowed our Manly family to survive several dynastic crises without invasion. In 1793, a civil war broke out during which an Ottoman officer deposed Ahmed's grandson, Ahmed, who had ruled since the overthrow of Ali I earlier that year. 2 years later, Ahmed returned to Tripoli with the aid of the Bey of Tunis and took control of the throne, but then only ruled 5 months when his brother Yusuf killed their father and another brother, deposed him, seized the throne, and sent Ahmed into exile while keeping his wife and children as hostages. So, I pronounced Ahmed Hamed for this reason that most of the literature, most of the secondary literature refers to Hamed, not Ahmed. So there's a difference here. So Hamed is the person who you'll hear more of soon. Working to conclude the treaty with Tripoli at minimum cost, Humphreys and Barlow used the good offices of the Dey of Algiers to draft a treaty with Pasha Yusuf over the years 1795 to 1797. This agreement provided peace for the United States with a one-time payment for the $56,485 and the release of captive American sailors, but no annual tribute. One of its provisions provided that further negotiations, if they proved necessary, the Dey of Algiers would be available to mediate, and that the first consul to be appointed by the United States would be obliged to bring an additional gift for the Bashaw. James Cathcart, the first U.S. consul appointed to Tripoli, reported to Secretary of State Timothy Pickering in 1798 that the Bashaw had refused to accept his credentials. Yusuf was unhappy over the American delay in paying the treaty sum in gifts. Then he also objected to the U.S. using the Dey of Algiers as a mediator because it made the Bashaw look less important and threatened a return to hostilities. Well, this led President Jefferson to consider a more forceful method of dealing with Tripoli. At the close of the Quasi-War in 1800, this is the Quasi-War with France, Jefferson administration ordered Commodore Richard Dale to prepare a squadron of 4 ships for a Mediterranean cruise to prevent the Barbary powers from breaking the peace, and to ascertain the state of relations between these powers and the United States. If any or all had declared war against the United States, Dale was ordered to blockade their ports and to, quote, sink, burn, and otherwise destroy their ships and vessels wherever you find them. By the time Dale arrived in the Mediterranean, he discovered that the Bashaw of Tripoli had indeed declared war against the United States. During the course of the First Tripolitan War, the American squadrons in the Mediterranean were commanded successively by 5 commodores. Dale was succeeded by Commodore Richard Morris, whose inactivity dissatisfied Washington. Commodore Edward Preble provided bold leadership and applied all the pressure at his disposal against the recalcitrant Bashaw. For assistance with diplomacy, Secretary Madison assigned Tobias Lear, a former consul to Santo Domingo, to work with Preble as a consul general to the North African states. After Captain William Bainbridge's frigate Philadelphia ran aground in October 1803, it was Preble's decision to burn her while she was in enemy hands. Shortly afterward, Preble received news that the Tunisians were preparing to make war against the United States because the United States had not paid the tribute it had promised. Preble's response was to call for reinforcements from the United States to continue operations against Tripoli and blockade Tunis at the same time. These people, he wrote, must not be humored but beaten, unquote. The energetic Preble established valuable bases in the Mediterranean at Sicily and Venice, hired seamen, borrowed gunboats and bomb vessels manned by foreign crews, purchased supplies and naval stores, and rebuilt and refitted his ships. These actions included blockades, shore bombardment, amphibious operations, and enabling American officers to hone their very valuable fighting skills. In early September 1804, Preble was superseded by the more senior Commodore Samuel Barron. Arriving with Barron was William Eaton, the former American consul to Tunis. Now, Eaton had obtained quiet approval from President Jefferson and his cabinet in March 1804 to develop a covert plan to force a victory. Eaton recruited a handful of volunteers, including a few U.S. Marines from the American squadron, a mixed force of European mercenaries found in Egypt, and Arab allies willing to fight under the banner of the Bashaw's exiled brother, Hamid. Before leaving the squadron, Commodore Preble encouraged Eaton as well, providing him with letters of introduction to Sir Alexander Ball, British Governor of Malta, who in turn provided Eaton with letters of introduction to British representatives in Alexandria and Cairo. The key to success would be to obtain the cooperation of the ousted Hamid, the former governor of Derna, who had fled to Egypt to escape his brother's wrath. At the time, Eaton sought out Hamid. Hamid, was 150 miles south of Cairo, fighting in a civil war, ostensibly for the Turks against the Mamelukes. However, he had managed to change sides and align himself with the Mamelukes. Eaton's daunting task then was to find Hamid, convince him that the United States was seriously committed, and then persuade the Turkish governor, Ahmed Pasha of Corsi, to let Hamid go. Eaton, who possessed a charismatic personality and a convincing military presence, charmed the Pasha and won over Hamid and his followers. They agreed on a rendezvous at Damanhur, an oasis south of Alexandria. On March 5th, 1805, this eclectic army set off on its march toward the coastal city of Derna, some 500 miles to the west. They gathered strength from tribesmen along the way, and finally, numbering 600 to 700 fighters and 500 Arab veteran camp followers. After many vicissitudes and several countermarches, Eaton gained the loyalty of his army long enough to arrive at the port of Bamba. Isaac Hull's sloop of war Argus brought them there provisions, supplies, and cash. Then, Eaton and Hamid led their followers to Derna, which with Hull's help they attacked, seized, and held against a cavalry force sent by Yusuf. The fact that Eaton's war party had succeeded as far as it did upset Yusuf's calculations, cost him funds and the loss of allies. Meanwhile, Samuel Barron's cruiser Commodore was cut short by ill health, and he was replaced by Commodore John Rogers. Now, Eaton had planned to push onward to Tripoli, but unbeknownst to him, Tobias Lear, backed by Rogers' squadron, had made a breakthrough in negotiations on June 4th. Several days later, the USS Constellation arrived off Derna and made a midnight extraction of Eaton, his Marines, and Hamid with his retinue. These events, combined with the strengthened naval blockades and diplomacy, weakened the will of the Bashaw. Tobias Lear's role came into play during Barron's illness. Never a supporter of Eaton's expedition, Lear was anxious to advance the pace of negotiations with Yusuf. The imprisoned Captain Bainbridge sent letters to Lear urging an early diplomatic settlement to forestall the Bashaw's retributions against his prisoners for the Eaton-Hamid expedition seizure of Derna. A peace treaty was finally agreed in June. The terms made no mention of future tribute payments, required the firing of gun salutes for American vessels, yet required the United States to pay a ransom of $60,000 for the release of Bainbridge and his crew. Now, there is little question that Eaton's expedition to Derna created a threat which pushed Bashaw Yusuf into major concessions which he was reluctant to make. The naval blockading squadron under Barron and Rogers threatened but did not attack Tripoli, perhaps because of fears that the Bashaw would execute American prisoners. Despite having these forces at his disposal, Tobias Lear yielded to Bashaw's passionate insistence on a final payment, but he was acting in accordance with his instructions, which allowed him to pay up to $600 per man freed. He was prepared, therefore, to pay $180,000 for 300 American sailors, but ended up paying only $60,000 to Nicholas Nissen, the Danish consul, who duly reported the fact to Copenhagen. With this agreement, Tripoli became less troublesome. Still, fully peaceful relations were not established until after the War of 1812. Not long after the treaty with Tripoli was signed, the Bey of Tunis disturbed the situation by threatening to declare war on the United States. He claimed the United States had not returned two prizes that he had agreed to restored to him after the escort had been captured. Commodore Rogers refused to return the vessels. On August 1st, 1805, the U.S. squadron anchored at Tunis, and Rogers asked the Bey what his intentions were, threatening to begin hostilities if he did not receive a reply in 36 hours. Ultimately, the Bey yielded and accepted the alternative of sending an ambassador to the United States to resolve the problem peacefully. During the years 1807 and 8, the squadron declined in strength as the vessels were needed in the United States. An increase in naval tensions between the United States and Great Britain occurred in June 1807, owing to the Chesapeake Leopard affair, and nearly all American ships were recalled from Europe. The American presence in the Mediterranean was limited to occasional visits from U.S. Navy ships on their homeward-bound voyages from Northern Europe. More difficulty arose with Algiers because the United States was late in producing 2 years' supply of naval stores stipulated by the treaty. When envoy Lear offered cash instead, the Dey refused it. Then he sent out a warship and captured 3 American merchantmen, one of which later escaped. The American sailors overpowered the prize crew and threw several Algerians overboard. When the Dey found out, 3 months later, he demanded $18,000 compensation from Lear. At first protesting he lacked authority to do this, Lear finally paid the money under duress. With the outbreak of the War of 1812, American trade in the Mediterranean diminished greatly. In early 1812, the British consul to Algiers arrived with a letter calculated to arouse the Dey against the Americans. When the American ship Allegheny anchored in Algiers with naval stores as part of the tribute payment arranged in 1795, the Dey rejected the shipment, claiming there were inferior products, and demanded $27,000 immediately on pain of imprisonment and bondage. Further, he demanded departure of Lear, his family, and many Americans remaining in Algiers, and then effectively broke the peace treaty by sending out his Corsairs against American shipping. While the United States was fully involved in the War of 1812, nothing forceful could be done in the way of releasing sailors newly captured in the Mediterranean, as in the case of Edmund on the 25th of August in 1812. This incident was to prove the catalyst for the settling of accounts with Algiers and the several other Barbary regencies once the War of 1812 came to an end. The master, first mate, and passenger were not confined, but the remaining crew of 8 was enslaved. In 1815, at the conclusion of the War of 1812, the United States was in a much stronger position to deal with the Barbary states, having built additional warships during the conflict, including several ships of the line. After a declaration of war, the United States sent 2 squadrons, the first comprised of 10 vessels, under the command of Commodore Stephen Decatur, Jr., who captured 2 Algerian vessels. With this as evidence of his force and determination, Decatur sent envoy Nathaniel Shaler to open negotiations with the Dey. He obtained an agreement that provided for the release of American captives, payment of compensation for Edwin, restoration of American property, for treatment of captives in any future war as prisoners of war, exempt from labor, and not as slaves, and excluded any payment of tribute. Despite many objections, the Dey finally signed the treaty. This was the occasion when Decatur wrote to the Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Crowninshield, saying the treaty was, quote, dictated with the mouths of our cannon, unquote. But he added that this advice, quote, the presence of a respectable naval force in this sea will be the only guarantee for its observance, unquote. Commodore William Bainbridge arrived in the Mediterranean with a squadron to reinforce Decatur's gunboat diplomacy. Bainbridge's flagship, the 74-gun Independence, provided the first appearance of an American ship of the line in those waters. By showing the showing of the flag by the second powerful squadron in Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis had a salutary effect because it had been rumored that the United States had agreed with Britain not to build ships of the size of Independence. When Bainbridge departed in October 1815, he left behind a small but capable squadron made up of the United States frigate United States, Constellation, Erie, and Ontario to protect American interests under Commodore John Shaw. When Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry arrived to relieve Shaw in March 1816, he brought with him the ratified treaty with Algiers. There he found a British squadron under Admiral Lord Exmouth, who was involved in negotiating the release of Christian slaves and for an agreement that in the future there would be no payment of ransom in exchange for prisoners. For it was not to be endured that England should tolerate what America had resented and punished, wrote Perry. However, this meeting ended in a violent disagreement of the day. Exmouth departed abruptly, but returned a year later with a much larger force and subjected the Algerians to a crushing bombardment before obtaining his objective. In conclusion, the United States had learned much in the way of diplomacy and the art of naval warfare since 1783. U.S. diplomats had learned how to bargain with the avaricious, mercurial, and often hostile Islamic rulers. The American naval officers had to confront clever maritime enemies whose primary tactics were those of boarding and hand-to-hand combat rather than standoff gunnery duels. This clash of maritime cultures led to the resolution of a crisis for more than 30 years standing through a combination of military action and diplomacy. The United States Navy's actions in the Mediterranean has shown the way for the old world naval powers in the use of gunboat diplomacy in dealing with the Barbary states. Naturally, as the commercial presence of the United States in the Mediterranean spread, the need for American naval diplomacy grew apace. For these reasons, the United States Navy has maintained a squadron in the Mediterranean from that day until our own, and the origins of the squadron are to be found in the events deriving from the very founding of the United States as an independent nation and the nature of commercial and military rivalries among the Mediterranean and European powers. Thank you.